Edward VIII, and Wallis Simpson. In the crisp chill of the early morning of 22nd January 1936, the great Victorian and Edwardian age of the British monarchy stood at a crossroads. The death of George V had ushered his eldest son, Edward Albert Christian, George Andrew Patrick David, simply known as Edward, onto the throne as King Edward VIII, a handsome, engaging figure, tall, athletic, charming. His naval training behind him, Edward now held the burden of a monarchy stretched across an empire and a world in flux. But beneath the gilded veneer and the royal ceremonies lay a tension that would culminate in one of the most extraordinary episodes in 20th century British history. A king renouncing his crown for a woman, a socialite twice divorced, an American. That woman was Wallis Simpson. Early lives and separate paths. Edward VIII was born on 23rd June 1894 at Richmond Park, Surrey. From an early age, he bore many names and initials, yet lived most of his youth under the informal moniker David. He was the eldest son of the Duke and Duchess of York, later George V and Queen Mary, meaning his childhood was framed by the majesty of the British monarchy and the continuity of the British Empire. The First World War saw him serve as a young officer. The war changed British society irrevocably, and Edward's generation was the first to feel. The empire's old certainties begin to tremble. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Wallace Warfield was born on 19th of June 1896 in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania. She came from an established American family. She was educated at Oldfield School in Maryland, later marrying in 1916 the U.S. naval pilot Earl Winfield Spencer Jr. The marriage ended in divorce in 1927. Shortly thereafter, she moved to England, married again in 1928, Ernest Aldrich Simpson, and entered London high society. It is vital to observe how disparate their worlds were. Edward, the heir to a throne steeped in tradition, duty, and ceremony. Wallis, an American divorcee, moving in elite circles, yet socially marginal from the point of view of British aristocratic norms, especially given her marital history. This divergence would later become central to the crisis. First encounters, allure, privilege, and the beginning of the unforbidden. In January 1931, at a party hosted by Lady Furness, Edward, then Prince of Wales, first met Wallis Simpson, still married to her second husband. The atmosphere was one of the lavish, interwar, aristocratic set. Yacht cruises, country houses, dinners under crystal chandeliers, holidaying along the Mediterranean coast. Yet the spark between them was immediate. Wallis's boldness, her American independence, and Edward's growing disaffection with many of the constraints of royal life combined to forge a bond that would ultimately upend monarchy. Edward fell in love with something he felt unable to find within the palace walls, a woman unafraid to challenge him, to expect him not to be merely the figurehead. By the summer of 1934, their relationship had deepened. On the private yacht, Rosora, the two spent long evenings at sea, away from gossiping eyes, the soft evening air, and the immense sea and sky, suggestive of a moment when friendship tipped into something more. Their passion, however, was set on a collision course with the realities of monarchy and society in Britain, the crown versus the heart. When Edward became king in January 1936, the intimacy of their relationship, though still publicly undeclared, had been an open secret in elite circles. Wallis's name appeared alongside his in foreign press, at society events, on yachts, while the British establishment digested the implications. The problem, in the eyes of government and church, went beyond simple marrying for love. It threatened the constitutional fabric. Divorce carried great stigma in British society. A monarch is not just an individual, he is a symbol. The established Church of England forbade the remarriage of divorced persons if the former spouse was living. That meant Wallis, a woman twice divorced, was unacceptable as future queen, in church and state eyes alike. In October and November 1936, the crisis peaked. Edward demanded government acceptance of his intended marriage to Wallis. Ministers, including Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, declared that such marriage could not be accepted by the people of Britain. A meeting at Buckingham Palace on 16th of November saw Baldwin inform Edward that no such marriage would command public support, and the monarchy risked a constitutional collapse. Wallis, sensing the impending storm, left Britain in early December for the south of France, while Edward remained at his country home, pacing in anxious contemplation. And then came 11th of December 1936. On the radio, the king addressed the nation. I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love. He renounced the throne. In his own words, he placed love above crown. The youngest, but one British monarch in centuries, thus stepped down. The next day, his brother Bertie, Duke of York, became King George VI. Abdication and the aftermath. New title, new life. By the terms of his abdication, Edward was created the Duke of Windsor. He relinquished the style of His Majesty and accepted life as one once king, now an exile of sorts. Wallis Simpson's divorce from Ernest Simpson was finalized in May 1937. She legally changed her name to Wallis Warfield, and the two married in France on 3rd of June 1937. Their marriage ceremony was small, private, held away from the full glare of court pomp and ceremony, a fitting reflection of their detachment from the traditional monarchy they had left behind. Yet although they achieved the union they desired, they did not regain full legitimacy in British royal circles. Wallis was never styled Her Royal Highness. Their marriage, from the British establishment's viewpoint, remained a deviation from royal norms. The exile life, sunshine, scandal, and shadow of war. Once free from the constraints of duty, Edward and Wallis embarked on a glamorous life abroad. The French Riviera, yachts, international high society, and sumptuous homes became their domain. They were the archetype of the cosmopolitan couple, stylish, mobile, media-worthy. But the glitz also hid undercurrents of scandal and suspicion. In 1937, Edward and Wallis visited Nazi Germany, an act that raised eyebrows then and continues to haunt historians now. Their political sympathies, especially Edward's perceived inclination toward appeasement and his proximity to far-right elements, cast a long shadow. With the outbreak of World War II, Edward was appointed governor of the British colony of the Bahamas from 1940 to 45, an arrangement by the establishment in part to keep him away from Europe. Meanwhile, Wallis accompanied him, though their lives remained a mixture of remote governance and high society living. After the war, the couple returned to France, settling into a life marked by luxury, social exclusivity, and a growing estrangement from the center of British royal life. Edward died in 1972. Wallis survived him until 1986. Reflections, love, duty, and the price of choice. In many ways, the story of Edward and Wallis is a deeply sensory one. Picture Edward's silhouette on the terrace at Fort Belvedere late in the afternoon, his navy blue suit catching the soft reflex of the Surrey skies, the scent of fresh cut grass and ivy in the gardens. Wallis arriving at society functions in London in the 1920s, her hat tilted just so, the rustle of silk whispering beneath chandeliers, laughter echoing in the wood-paneled drawing rooms, the two of them aboard the Rosora, the salt spray on the navy paintwork, the sound of waves against the hull, and that pre-dawn hush between them when the sea and sky stretched eternal and no one else existed. And yet in every rose-lit moment of romance lies the hardening of reality, the sharp click of government officials closing ranks, the hush of taxis in dark lanes as Wallis slips away to France, the muffled echo of a BBC microphone as Edward's voice booms into living rooms across the empire, announcing his abdication. Thematically, their tale invites reflection on the boundaries between personal freedom and institutional duty. Edward's decision to relinquish the throne may appear heroic, the sovereign choosing love over power, but it also underscores the brittle architecture of monarchy. When the weight of tradition, religion, and public expectation have been borne for centuries, even the king cannot simply bend them. Wallis, for her part, becomes a fulcrum, American, divorced, social straddler, glamorous, and reviled in equal measure. Her presence forces the monarchy to ask what it means to be royal in modern times. Does marriage remain an arrangement of duty, or can it be union of equals? And if the king chooses love, what then of the crown? Their story is often styled as the romance of the century, but read more closely, the reality is layered. A union forged outside established norms, a partnership steeped in ambition, glamour, and at times deep unease. According to some historical accounts, Wallis did not always love Edward in the way he loved her. The balance of power in their relationship was uneven. The glamour had a sharp edge, and yet perhaps that very unevenness is part of the truth. Because love is rarely balanced, the man who relinquished a throne for a woman still carried his burdens. The woman who entered history as the twice divorced American still lived in the liminal space of insider-outsider. The legacy and its resonance. Today, what remains of Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson's story is more than a footnote of royal trivia. It touches on broader questions of identity, of sovereignty, of the modern versus the traditional. Their abdication paved the way, ultimately, for the reign of Elizabeth II and thereby shaped the trajectory of the British monarchy in the later 20th century. One can imagine the scent of old wood in the drawing rooms at Windsor, the feel of gloved hands passing tea, the weight of a tiara on a cousin's head, and understand how radical it seemed that Edward said, "I cannot discharge my duties without the help and support of the woman I love." The monarchy listens quietly to those words, even today. Moreover, their story interrogates the idea of exile in its many forms: physical, social, emotional. Edward may have left the throne behind, but he did not leave the trappings of status. Wallis may have gained the aspirations of social standing, but often remained judged and marginalized. They lived in France, yet looked back across the Channel. They built lives of splendor, yet had to craft legitimacy outside the walls of the palace. And for the modern listener or reader, there is the sensory aftertaste, the slow turning of heavy curtains in a palatial drawing room, The hush of conversation in a French garden, the distant echo of children's laughter on a colonial lawn in the Bahamas, the ripple of suspicion in the newsreel as they visited Germany in 1937. Their story is not simply a romantic myth, but a layered human drama. Love, yes, but also power, duty, sacrifice, alienation, charm, and scandal. The final years and reflection. It is now the late 1960s. Edward, the Duke of Windsor, walks through the library at his Paris home, Villa Windsor. Books line the shelves. The muted daylight filters through tall windows, casting soft gold on the Persian rugs. Wallis sits beside him, her fashionable elegance undimmed, though the years have tempered her public sparkle. They exchange few words. In their long years together, they have said the things that needed saying. Outside, the gardens stir with a gentle autumn breeze. Suddenly, Edward stops, flicks open a small velvet-lined box. Inside, the shell-pink corsage he had gifted Wallis in the 1930s aboard the Rosora. The smell of sea air, of long past voyages, returns. Wallis touches it briefly, her gloved hand still poised, her mind elsewhere. The moment is tender, slightly wistful. They have lived their lives outside the mainstream of British monarchy, but within the world of their choosing. Finally, the day comes. Edward dies on 28th of May, 1972. Wallis outlives him by 14 years, but her later life is increasingly solitary, marked by fragility and retrospection. She dies in Paris on 24th of April, 1986. As finality closes in, one might hear the distant echo of Edward's radio broadcast, the hush of the British public listening in 1936, the swoosh of a flag at half-mast, the rustle of scandal murmurs. And yet, one might also hear the sigh of two people who traded a crown for each other, not for glory, necessarily, but for a different kind of being. Thematic takeaway. At its core, the story of Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson interrogates, what do we give up for love? Edward gave the crown. Wallis gave acceptance. Both accepted exile, of sorts, but they also gained one another, and in that exchange lies both tragedy and triumph. Their narrative invites us to reflect on the tension between institutional roles and personal authenticity. A king made a choice that thousands of years of precedent said he must not. An American socialite entered an aristocratic world that did not want her. Together, they created a life that was glamorous and scandalous, public and private, full of agency and still constrained by the world. For the modern listener, the scent of privilege and the weight of consequence resonate alike. The seashells on the yacht, the pewter in the abdication office, the croquet on the lawn at Wanderers Club, all marks of a life lived at the meeting point of tradition and revolt. In one sense, their saga is the ultimate realism of romance, not just the fairy tale of love triumphing over duty, but the deeper, messier truth that to follow the heart may mean forsaking everything else, and that forsaking is a cost as well as a choice. Final thoughts. As we look back, the camera of history pans slowly across their lives. Edward, once king, now duke. Wallis, once excluded, now duchess in exile. The bright lights fade, the crowds thin, the off-camera whispers grow quiet. What remains is two people sharing common ground in a world that told them they could not. And depending on the lens one uses, one can see them either as romantic rebels or tragic outsiders, perhaps both at once. They reflect our own conflicts of obligation and freedom, of identity and belonging, of love and sacrifice. In the hush after the last echo of the royal broadcast, when the tapestries are still and the flags calm, we are left with the image of a couple standing together, outside the circle of power, but nonetheless bound by their choice. And so, dear listener, thank you for traveling this journey with me across gilded halls and sea-sprayed decks, through scandal and exile, love and legacy. If you've enjoyed this story, do please like and subscribe. Ring the notification bell so you won't miss the next deep dive into history's vivid characters. Until next time, this is Mad Historian, and I'll see you in the past.